Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to the Kingdom of Malacca. I hope you're having an amazing day, because if you're having an amazing day, I'm having an amazing day. If I'm having an amazing day, you should be having an amazing day. Today I'm standing on, a 1600s Dutch fort. Yes, this was a fort used by the VOC, or the Dutch East Indies Company, in order to serve as a rampart to protect their private property 400 years ago. And these are actual VOC cannons. And this is where the infant stages of capitalism, the mode of production we call capitalism, first began. This is where capitalism began to walk, metaphorically speaking. And these are actual Dutch cannons from the 1600s. You see the VOC symbol? Yes. They were used as part of the defensive rampart by the Dutch East Indies Company. The first multinational company in the world. And it was used, to protect their private property from other capitalists, known as pirates. And this is where capitalism first began. See, placing the cannons at the mouth of the Malacca River is a very logical position to place them. Back then, all of those buildings obviously didn't exist, but the best way to enter Malacca would be through the Malacca River from the sea, and that's why this is where the most logical place to place your defensive rampart would be. See, capitalism as a mode of production isn't really very old. In fact, it's only about 400 to 500 years old. And you'd be forgiven for thinking that capitalism has existed for hundreds or thousands of years. But as a matter of fact, trade and capitalism are not necessarily the same thing. You see, trade has always existed. Whether that be in the time of slave society, or in feudal society, or in capitalist society, trade has existed at some level or other, whether that be barter trading or trading of commodities with coins or paper notes. But capitalism sees the rise of the capitalist class, the bourgeoisie or the merchant class, taking political power for themselves and controlling the workings of the state. And in previous epochs, the merchants never had such power. And it is this mode of production that attracts the Portuguese, the Dutch, and the British, that's how I got my accent, to Malaya, or the Malay Peninsula, all for the profit motive. So today I'm going to take you on a trip down memory lane, explaining how and why the Portuguese, the Dutch, and the British came scrambling for Southeast Asia. Let's go! You can think of capitalism as having three distinct phases, the first of which being the early stage of capitalism, which we will discuss today, in the 1500s and 1600s, when the merchants began arising as a powerful political player, and they actually have the power to navigate or charter the course of nations. And then you have the mid-stage of capitalism, the Industrial Revolution in the 1700s and the 1800s, when you see the mode of production shift from farm to factory. And then you have now the late stage of capitalism, also described as imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism by Vladimir Lenin, when the increased or the excessive competition between rival groups of capitalists create a thing known as monopolies. For example, the East India Company by Britain. So those are examples of monopolies, or companies which have unchecked power to do whatever they want, and who are basically a nation unto themselves. Because for the first time in human history, capitalism actually sees the businessman, the merchant, or the factory owner having the political power to own a private army of himself, right? And basically, this sort of power is basically what trumps or what appends the feudalists. So behind me is St. Paul's Hill, which was used as a defensive hill by both the Portuguese and the Dutch. So I'm going to show you a couple of Portuguese and Dutch buildings from the time period of the 1500s and the 1600s. The Portuguese came here in 1511, the Dutch came here in the 1600s. In fact, there's actually a funny story in chapter 31 of volume 1 of Karl Marx's Das Kapital, in which Karl Marx explains how the Dutch overthrew the Portuguese. Now, by no means were the Dutch the good guys in the story, but they were basically capitalist on capitalist violence.
To secure Malacca, the Dutch corrupted the Portuguese governor. He led them into the town in 1641. They hurried at once to his house and assassinated him to abstain from this payment of 21,875 guineas, the price for his treason. Wherever they set foot, devastation and depopulation followed. Bourgeoisie, a province in Java, in 1750 numbered over 80,000 inhabitants. In 1811, only 18,000. Sweet commerce!
But look, I don't want you to think it was anything personal when they did away with that guy. It's all business. You see, the profit motive basically makes people do things that are morally questionable, but not out of any personal malice, of course. Capitalists, you see, keep slaves, divide the world, and exploit people, not out of any personal malice, but rather a desire to increase their capital and to protect their own class interests. You see, when the Portuguese, the Dutch, and the British came to Malaya, is it because they were big meanies who hated Asian people and wanted to bully them? Well, that's the common perception that, oh, they thought Asian people were weak and Asian people were easily bullied and they thought Asian people were inferior. But as a matter of fact, the only reason they were here was for the profit motive. That's all. You see? I'm taking you to the oldest church in all of Southeast Asia. But first, you've got to climb this damn hill. It's definitely not obese-friendly, and it's definitely not wheelchair-friendly. They should really make a wheelchair... Oh, they actually do have a wheelchair ramp on the other side. But, oh, you have to climb this damn hill. You know, in a couple of years, I might not be able to climb this. I'm getting old. I'm already 34. But I can get there. I can get to the top. Just give me a bit of time. Ooh. Okay, we're finally here. We, ladies and gentlemen, are at St. Paul's Church, which is the oldest church in Southeast Asia, built by the Portuguese in 1521 for its residents, for its Catholic residents. It was later taken over by the Dutch and used as a burial place to bury some of the early Dutch settlers.
네덜란드 식이 180년 동안 여기는 전부 다 올라오는 네덜란드 사람들이 그러다가 영국하고 전쟁할 때 호경 가져와서 박살났는 한꺼번을 여기다가 내려가다가 움직이게 된 거예요. 자, 카메라다 빌렸어요. 카메라를 빌려서
This is where Francis Xavier was buried for a couple of weeks. Well, not strictly speaking buried. They put his body in there for a couple of weeks before they moved it to India. Apparently his body didn't rot in there. It must be very cold underneath. Right, let's get back to the topic at hand. So why were the Portuguese and the Dutch here again? Was it to enjoy our weather, our food, our culture? Or was it because Malacca was a very strategic entrepot, located conveniently between India and China? A perfect place to rest and refuel for people going to India or going to China, or people coming from China or coming from India. You see, so Malacca in its heyday in the 1400s and 1500s was basically the New York of Asia. It was basically a bustling entrepot where international commerce really took off. And it is said that he who is the Lord of Malacca has his hand on the throat of Venice. This is what they often would say. So to understand what is meant by that, you have to think of it in terms of chain economics. Now, at the time, Venice had a monopoly on the spice trade due to its relations with Malacca. And the Portuguese were very, very determined to get their hands on Malacca. Because if they could control Malacca, literally control Malacca, they could control the inflow and outflow of spices. And not only that, they could also control the prices of spices, which would make them the spice boys, or the spice boy monopoly of the region, you see. And that is why Malacca was seen as an extremely tantalizing prize. It's due to its strategic location between India and China. And conquer Malacca the Portuguese did in 1511. And the fall of Malacca is really a combination of a variety of factors, chiefly corruption within the Malacca court. But the fact of the matter is that after Portugal conquered Malacca, it basically established itself as one of the most powerful trading empires of the region. But then the Dutch also started hankering for the same thing. And so the Dutch, we get to the Dutch at this point in the 1600s, oust the Portuguese and set up shop in Malacca. But why do we call this form of production capitalism? And why do we not call the old form of trading, whether that be barter trading and, of course, trading, passing goods from one merchant's hand to a customer's hand and passing money from a customer's hand to a merchant's hand? Why do we not call that capitalism? Well, fundamentally it's because of the relations with the power dynamics that is occurring. Because in this time period, in the 1500s and the 1600s, the wealth of nations starts to be monopolized, pardon the pun, by the merchant class. That is to say, it is the merchant class who has the naval expertise and the commercial knowledge who are able to actually acquire those spices and silks and diamonds and jewels for the crown. And so the monarchs, whether it be the monarchs of all parts of Europe, they start putting a lot of faith in the merchant class. And the merchant class becomes a very, very powerful political player in the grand scheme of things. They are given inordinate power to do things that they never could do in previous epochs. See, during feudalism, the merchant class did not receive a very high degree of prestige. They were not very highly ranked on the social hierarchy because the mode of production was basically the feudal lord owns land and the peasant lives on the land, and the feudal lord is basically the one with political power. During feudalism, merchants were basically traders, like market vendors or people who did services for people, like tanners, who would basically give you a service in exchange for your coin. Now, the money that you gave to the merchants in that time did not really become capital in the modern sense, because it was not accumulated in such a vast degree as it is today. Capital, the advent of capital accumulation, occurs in the 1500s and 1600s, when the merchant class is given political power to do things they never could do in previous epochs, like having an army of their own, for example. So because the merchant class serves as such an important economic backbone, they receive privileges that no other group receives. For example, Christopher Columbus gets a fleet of his own, Vasco da Gama gets a fleet of his own, and of course the VOC, which is the Dutch East India Company, which is comprised of a group of Dutch shareholding merchants. Shareholding was a way for them to minimize their loss. So, because international trade was very, very risky. If a merchant invested money in a ship and a crew to go and procure spices from Malacca or from India or what have you, he risked losing his entire capital if that ship sunk. So in order to minimize the loss and encourage the investment of money into trade, what the Dutch government did was basically to create the VOC, or the Dutch East India Company, which was a shareholding company in which Dutch shareholders would each put in a bit of money, of their own money, and basically whatever was lost in their joint venture, they would foot the only bit of money they would lose is the money they invested in it. So they might not lose an entire fleet's worth of money. But the point is, the VOC receives privileges and perks that no merchant in any past epoch ever had. Like, they had the power to actually execute people, not of course in the Netherlands itself, but in the colonized regions. They had the power to use military force to get what they wanted. And of course, they basically were a nation in itself, a nation within a nation. Because, they basically were given an army of their own. So, fundamentally, they were the first multinational corporation in the world. And this is where we see the first stage of capital accumulation, because in previous generations, people traded to survive. Trade was merely a form of survival. Like, I produce something and I sell it and I receive some money in return and it reproduces my existence. But for the first time in their life, the merchant class is now able to emerge as a politically powerful class. And while the first vestiges of the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie started taking root in the 1500s and 1600s with the domination of the Dutch and the Portuguese in the East Indies, the final nail in the coffin of feudalism was really hammered when they cut off King Louis XVI's head as a sort of like a symbolic gesture to the feudalists that, look, we, the bourgeoisie, are in charge now. But what the feudalists did not realize was that they had been in charge. They had been pulling the strings for the last 100 or more years. It's just that in name, they were merchants, but they were really the kingmakers behind the throne, because they were the backbone of their own respective economies. And that's why people who were petty traders, or people who were tanners, who had a tanning business of their own, eventually ended up becoming proletarianized, because they were subsumed by the emerging capitalist class. They were defeated by the more ruthless merchants, who ended up starting monopolies, and then they ended up getting subsumed. They ended up having to work for their former competitors. And this is where the capital class, or the owners of the means of production, really begin to take hold of the throat of society. And this comes full circle in the 1700s during the Industrial Revolution, when factory production becomes a thing. And basically it is the capitalist class who literally own the means of production. Now, is capitalism an inherently evil system? No, there are no inherently kind or inherently evil systems. That's idealist talk. But capitalism is basically the mode of production that felled feudalism. It was basically the rival mode of production that took over society at the end of feudalism. So it basically inherited the state apparatus of the feudalists, like the police force and the army and the slaves as well, believe it or not, and it transformed the peasant into a proletarian worker. So while it was supposed to emancipate the working class or the peasant class, it didn't really lead to any real emancipation, but rather it shifted their relations with the mode of production. So basically, the peasant was working in a field, that was the mode of production. Under capitalism, the mode of production became a factory. That was fundamentally the change in the peasant's lot. Now, would I say that capitalism was not an improvement over feudalism? No, of course not. It certainly was, because with capitalism also comes the notion of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So monarchs can't just chop your heads off if they don't like you, or they can't torture you arbitrarily. But capitalism has merely simplified class antagonisms. It has basically broken society down into two hostile camps: the capitalist and the worker. And from the Marxian point of view, this is the last stage of class antagonisms. So the nail in the coffin of class society, the first nail, you could say, was hammered by the capitalists. And the second nail will be hammered by the proletarians. And the third and final nail will be hammered with the withering away of the state, basically when the proletariat cease to be a class altogether. But that's another topic for another day. We oppose capitalism not only because it has not really brought about true emancipation for the workers, but also because it has, like an overripe fruit, gotten stale, metaphorically speaking. Capitalism has reached the point when monopolies dominate the market. Monopolies, also known as oligarchs, dominate the market. And it is these groups that basically control the world, and basically, according to Lenin, this is the new form of capitalism, the international form of capitalism, when there is not enough resources within the local regions for the capitalists to satisfy the ever-growing demands of capital and the ever-growing thirst for profit, that they have to start branching out, right? And they have to start doing nasty things for the profit motive, because the profit motive is basically what drives the atrocities of the modern world. As Marx tells us, the bourgeoisie, in creating a world unto its own image, has also given us the key to our own liberation, because they have basically brought nations out of their so-called slumber. Marx is very, very unsavory in his vocabulary when he describes, in fact, he describes the hereditary stupidity of the Chinese being jolted awake by the British cannon. So it's a very, very, Marx doesn't really pull punches in saying that the bourgeoisie has basically woken nations up and installed a sense of class consciousness in the people. And that, ironically, will be the very thing that fails them. Internal corruption and the inability to cooperate saw the end of the VOC, replaced by the British in the 1700s. And it is the superstructure of the British, the legal system, the way of dressing, and the way of talking, and English as a compulsory language, that dominates the current mode of production. But this mode of production is soon to fall, because just like slave society, just like feudal society, capitalist society also has an expiry date. And it will come, my friends. So I hope it's made clear that the reason why the Portuguese, the Dutch, and the British were here is not because they were evil. Well, they were evil, but they were not here specifically because they were evil, but because they were following the profit motive of capitalism. But capitalism has also proven to be a double-edged sword for the ruling class, because while it is an exploitative mode of production that basically replaced feudalism, it has also given the people the key to their own liberation. For example, the superstructure of the British that was left behind by the state apparatus of the British left me with the English language, which allows me to communicate this message to you. Because in all likelihood you speak English, don't you? So the bourgeoisie, in creating a world in their own image, has also given us the key to our own liberation. And we have to take it. So yes, support the rise of socialism and have a wonderful day.